Back. Uh, we have been talking about the movement west of the pioneers, and we talked about uh, the Santa Fe and the Oregon Trail. And today we're going to talk about a very specialized group of pioneers. We're going to talk about the Mormons. The Mormons had a unique reason for moving west. Most pioneers moved west for economic reasons. They were seeking land, they were seeking the freedom from the moneyed classes, they were seeking their independence economically. Next week, we'll see a group of people that moved west primarily for adventure, the gold seekers, those who were looking to strike it rich. So, well, this week we're going to talk about a group of people, as I said, the Mormons, who went west for freedom of religion. It was a new religion. It had been founded early in the 19th century in America, and it didn't fare well with its neighbors originally. They feared it, they misunderstood it. Many of the doctrines of the church didn't sit well with the established religions. And as a result, it seemed like everywhere they went, they were met with violence. And so finally, they ended up moving westward into what we now know as Utah, which was probably the most unhospitable and, pardon my grammar, godforsaken land in America. They didn't see it that way. So let's look and see how this happened and the events surrounding the Mormon religion, and particularly the impact it had upon future travelers west. I always start out with a painting. It's a painting by a man by the name of William Tiley Rainey. It's called Advice on the Prairie. And as you can see, basically you've got a guide sitting around talking to a group of travelers, pioneers, and these were Mormons. Rainey was a Mormon, and he painted this from a Mormon perspective. And he was talking to them about what they should expect for the rest of the trail. So let's look at the church. The Mormon Church, just a little bit about the origin of the church, because I'll be very honest, most of us probably don't understand the Mormon religion as, pardon me here, as because it's not as big of a church in America as the other churches, the Christian church, and for heaven's sakes, I surely don't mean to be offensive to anyone if I say something wrong. I'm not a Mormon, and I really have never been around a lot of Mormons. And to quote Will Rogers, I only know what I read in the newspapers. So hopefully I don't offend anyone, and I surely don't mean to, because I always say I'm a member of a disorganized religion. I'm a Baptist, and you that are a Baptist understand that. We probably make fun of ourselves more than anybody else. So let's look at the origins of the church. Of all the motives for Western migration, the seeking of religious freedom was the strongest. And without a doubt, the religious group that suffered the most in the 19th century in America was the Mormon Church. Its origins lie with a man by the name of Joseph Smith, who was raised in upstate New York around the area around Palmyra. And he was raised originally in a Methodist church, but he was also raised during what was known as the Second Great Awakening, a great Christian revival that took place all over the northeastern part of the United States in the early 19th century. And he became an extremely spiritual young man and would spend days and days wandering in the forest, in the woods, seeking God's wisdom. In 1821, Smith claims to have had a vision in which God told him that all the churches had turned aside from the Gospels, and he was to begin to gather up followers and lead a revival, and that he would learn more as he went along. And being the spiritual person that he was, this is exactly what he did. And this is Joseph Smith, a painting of a young Joseph Smith. Smith only had lived to be in his early 40s. but he is the founder of the church. 1823, 3 years after he received his first vision from God, he claimed that he had another vision, that he was visited by an angel by the name of, I believe it's pronounced Moroni, who disclosed to him the location of a set of golden plates as well as a set of glasses he called interpreters. And he said that it was told him that he could use these interpreters to translate the plates because they were written in something he referred to as Reformed Egyptian, kind of a hieroglyphics type language. He was unallowed to dig these plates up for 4 years. And during the interim period, he gained followers throughout New York. And being a very charismatic spiritual man, he did gain a lot of followers. By 1827, he was allowed to dig the plates up, he said, and he and his followers moved to Harmony, Pennsylvania. And it was here that he went about translating the golden plates. And this was completed by 1831, and he published the book called the Book of Mormon. And not long after that, he and his followers then moved westward into Kirtland, Ohio. And his religion began to grow very rapidly at this. The Book of Mormon had a lot to do with this. This is a replica of the golden plates and the interpreters. These are obviously not the real ones. It's my understanding from my reading that the golden plates were taken away from him. But these are kind of a replica of those. Well, as you might imagine, Smith's new religion didn't exactly set well with his Christian neighbors, even though they identified as Christians. They said that they were Christians and they were merely following visions of God to further enhance the Christian religion. And so he, after meeting some resistance in Harmony, Pennsylvania, he moved his followers westward again into Kirtland, Ohio. And they lived there for a while and once again met up with violence and resistance. And so they began to move again, and this time they moved to Missouri. I found this very interesting because I didn't know a lot about this until I began to study it. He moved into western Missouri, and he announced that he had a vision in which the hamlet of Independence, it was just a very small village then, not the big city it is now, the suburb of Kansas City. He said that this was the site of the original Garden of Eden and was to be the new Jerusalem or Zion. And so they began to plan out a temple. They began to establish residences. But as was the history of his religion, he met a lot of resistance again. And he and his followers were basically driven out of Independence, just like they had Kirtland and Harmony. And this time they moved into north central Missouri, into a very isolated area in a little county called Daviess County, near the little town of Gallatin, Missouri. And again, he had a revelation. He claimed that he said that this community, this area, was the site that Adam and Eve had fled once they were evicted from the Garden of Eden. And he gave it a name. He called it Adam Ondi Aman. And again, they began to establish residences. They began to set up basically what they considered to be their final home. And this is a photograph of Adam Ondi Aman. I've been here. I had some friends that lived in Gallatin, Missouri, and we visited them quite often when we were younger. And we visited some of the historical places around Gallatin, one of which was a bank that Jesse James robbed. And he took us out here, and I really didn't know anything about it at this time, but he took us to this and kind of told me a little bit about what the Mormon religion was about and about this site. August of 1838, the Mormons' history repeated itself. They once again began to run into trouble with their neighbors. This time, it occurred because of the voting in an election. It seems as how some of the neighbors were fearing that Smith and his followers were going to set up a theocratic local government where they were going to basically try to run their government. And violence erupted at the voting places. It got really bad. There were some deaths. And finally, the governor of Missouri was alerted, and he called out the state militia, and he issued an executive order. And this is a quote. He said, all Mormons are to be exterminated or driven from the state. And that's basically what was happening. Smith himself and some of his followers were jailed, more for their own self-protection than anything else. And eventually he was allowed to escape and follow his followers who had moved back east over the Mississippi River and near a little town called Nauvoo. And Nauvoo became the site of the Mormons for the next several years. It grew in size to about 15,000 people, and they lived in relative peace. Apparently, they'd learned some things. They became much more insulated and isolated from their neighbors, and they lived in relative peace around Nauvoo for several years. Then in 1844, Smith once again revealed a vision. And he said his latest vision was a revelation that a man had a spiritual duty to marry as many women as he could. Now, there's all sorts of reasons for this happening. Obviously, Smith said it happened because that's what God told him to do. There's also the truth in the fact that the church was attracting many more women than it was men, and that, the women needed husbands. And some people think it was an economic and a social situation. But for whatever reason, it set very ill at ease with his neighbors. And once again, violence erupted in Nauvoo. And this time, Smith again was jailed along with his brother and a few other followers. And this time, Smith was killed. Smith was assassinated it's reported, by several members of the state militia, which were sent there to guard him. So Smith is killed, very young age. I believe he was 42. This is the Joseph Smith house in Nauvoo. You can go to Nauvoo, and it's very well restored. It's a historical site now, and my understanding, it's still a site of several Mormons. Several Mormons still live there. But this is the Joseph Smith house. The leadership of the church passed to the man that most of us associate with the Mormon Church, a man by the name of Brigham Young. Brigham Young was one of the earliest converts to Mormonism, and he was the president of the kind of like the elders of the church. He called them the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. And it passed the passage of the church, went to him, the leadership. He was a very pragmatic, a very charismatic, and also a very autocratic leader. But he was absolutely determined that his religion was going to survive. And he realized that in order for it to do that, they were going to have to move basically away from everybody. He said, we cannot live long with and he called them Gentiles. He said, we cannot live with the Gentiles. If we do, we're doomed. And so he said, we have to move somewhere away from all the other people. And he obviously realized this was into the West. He just didn't know where at that time. He said, but wherever it is, we're going to move, we're going to thrive, and we're going to establish our city of God. So he went into a period of study. He went into a period of time where he began to read government documents, and he particularly read John C. Fremont's journals. And John C. Fremont, if you'll recall, explored the Great Salt Lake area, and basically he indicated the Great Salt Lake was one of the most inhabitable sites in America. And this really struck a chord with Young. And Young decided that this might be the place for them to move. And so he announced that he thought the Great Salt Lake might be the chosen land. And so he set about moving his group of followers to the Great Salt Lake. And this is a picture of an elder, Brigham Young. He was a younger man at this time. This was at Brigham Young towards probably the 1870s or so, 1860s. So how did this trek begin? Well, first of all, it has to be described as probably the most organized trek of pioneers in the history of the Western migration in America. Most of the other treks by groups of pioneers, as I mentioned last week, were in groups of just maybe a couple hundred. And although they followed paths, they weren't all that organized necessarily. Brigham Young was a very organized man, and he absolutely organized this trek westward to the very nth detail. And it served as a model later for other groups that wanted to head west. He moved them in small, manageable segments. He moved them across the river originally into Iowa, and they settled around Council Bluffs, Iowa that winter. And that became known as winter quarters. And you can go to Council Bluffs or the winter quarters in Iowa, and you can see, where they spent their winter. It was a bad winter. It was very miserable. There was not a lot of food. Disease broke out. They were cold. And I am sure that there were probably a lot of Mormons begin to wonder if this was the right thing to do. But they survived. And without a lot of life lost. And that spring, Young and 148 of what he called his saints, some of the elders in the church, they moved out of winter quarters and headed west to try to find an ideal location to settle permanently. They traveled basically what was the Oregon Trail, only they traveled on the north side of the Platte River instead of the south side because they wanted to avoid the other immigrants who were made up a lot of Missourians, and he felt like they would not be welcome. So they kind of traveled opposite from the other immigrants. This is the winter quarters of the National Historic Site in Council Bluffs, Iowa. And you can go there and you can, see a lot about the history of the Mormon Church up to that point. It took him about 3 months for Brigham Young to reach what we now know as the Great Salt Lake in Salt Lake City. He got there, and needless to say, some of his followers were just a little bit demoralized. He issued an order. He said, there's plenty to be done here. He said they dammed up a mountain river. They began to irrigate the ground. They plowed it. They seeded it. And even though a lot of his followers, those 58 saints, doubted him, he said, no, this is the right place. I know this is where God has directed us, and we are going to settle here. No one questioned his authority. As I said, Brigham Young was a very revered man in his church, and whatever he said, they believed and they followed. He began to lay out his vision of the city in intricate detail. I've never been to Salt Lake City, but I understand it's a very beautiful city with wide, broad boulevards. The streets are diagonal to each other, and this indicates the vision of Brigham Young. He wanted his city to be a beautiful city and pleasant to the eye, and he wanted it to have a lot of detail to it. And indeed, that's my understanding of Salt Lake City. Early on, they adopted the beehive as the symbol of their city. This was to memorialize the hard work that they did, the cooperation necessary to make the city bloom. And, bees, of course, are very industrious insects, noted for their hard work and never quitting. And this was the Mormon symbol as such, the beehive. And it's kind of on a lot of Mormon, it's in their tabernacles, in their homes, and the beehive is kind of their symbol. That spring, he ordered the rest of the Mormons to start heading west. Uh, it's my understanding that he actually designed this cart. Most Mormons could not afford wagons. The wagons were pretty expensive. And so he ordered the building of these carts. These were hand carts. And a person would walk inside the carts here and pull their belongings. And so they began to move westward in groups of 100 or so at a time, led by kind of like a conductor, and they would head west, pulling these hand carts westward into the Great Salt Lake. By autumn, it was home to 15,000 true believers. Yep, they moved them all that summer for the most part. It was one of the most monumental feats that we've seen in the movement into the American West. Unfortunately, that winter was again a really, really bad winter. There were bad snows. The temperatures dropped exceedingly, and it was an extremely harsh winter for the saints. That spring, their crops began to grow, and they were very, they were very happy because they could see the fruits of their labor pushing up through the ground. It was that time that one of the miracles of the church, as they cited, happened. Apparently, a infestation of crickets and locusts attacked their crops and began to devour their crops. And they knew that they were doomed. They knew that there was no way that they were going to be able to survive if their crops did not grow. And so Young ordered all of the saints down on their knees, and they began to pray for a miracle from God. And it's at that time that the Mormon Church says seagulls arrived. Now, you might say, well, how in the world did seagulls get into the interior part of the United States? Well, it's obvious. They came from the Great Salt Lake. And these seagulls devoured the insects en masse, saved the crops, and the Mormons were saved. This is just another one of the stories of the Mormon religion that they tell and that they revere in their religion. He never wavered. Young didn't. He named his community Deseret. He said, this is what our country is going to be called. Our area is going to be called Deseret. And they began to work hard. Salt Lake City began to grow. And everything was looking really, really good for the Mormons. And then they probably made an early tactical mistake. Young asked for statehood. He asked for the government to give them statehood. And probably in retrospect, it was a little bit too early for that. Because once they did that, it kind of aroused the sentiments of the people back in the East again against the Mormons. This is a photograph of the early building of the temple. This would have not have occurred at this time. This occurred later, as I understand it, probably in the period maybe after the Civil War that they were building the temple. But this is the Mormon temple that dominates the interior of Salt Lake City that they were building. So Young petitions for statehood. It brought attention back to the Christians back east. And once again, all the old animosities, all the old anger began to rise up against the Mormon Church, particularly because of the practice of polygamy. This just did not set well with the Christians back east. And as a result, there was once again anger kind of towards the Mormons. They were granted territorial status, 1850, but the government said, we're not going to call it Deseret, we're going to call it Utah, in memorializing the group of Indians that live primarily in the area, the Utes. And again, this was done primarily in anger towards the Mormons. And they also took away a lot of the land that the Mormons claimed. They claimed a lot of land that we now know as Nevada, a little bit of Idaho, some of Arizona, and they said, no, this is not going to be part of your territory. We're going to cut it down in size into what we now know as Utah. Uh, they did have the good sense to appoint Brigham Young the head of the territory. He was appointed the territorial governor, but all other officials were what they referred to as Gentiles from the east. So the Mormons were uneasy. They felt like the government was not responding to them well. They felt like that they were not following through with their promises. 1857, President Buchanan uh, ordered Young to be replaced with a man by the name of Alfred Cummings as the territorial governor. And the Mormons kind of revolted against this. They said, we don't want this, we don't like it. On top of that, Buchanan was a pro-Southern sympathizer, and they were scared that he was going to implement slavery, allow slavers into the state, which the Mormon Church was absolutely against. And they basically told the United States government, we're not going to follow this. We're not going to do what you tell us to do. This is our land. We found it. We built it up, and you're not going to take it from us. At that, Buchanan ordered the army into Utah to assume control. He was basically going to take and declare martial law in what we now know as Utah. This was the last straw. Once the Mormons heard this, that it was Nauvoo, it was Missouri, it was Kirtland, Ohio, it was all these areas that had been run out of all over again. And they said, this is it. We're not taking it. And at that, what became known as the Mormon War erupted. Now, it never really developed into a full-fledged war between the American Army and the Mormons, but it was a period of intense negotiations, a period when both camps were armed, and it was a period when war could have broken out very, very easily between the Mormons and the United States Army. This is part of the Army detachment that was sent westward to, basically fight the Mormons if they chose to do that. And the Mormons said, that's what we're going to do. They said, we're not doing this again. They formed their own army, which they referred to as Danites, and they let it be known that they were going to burn and destroy everything in Utah before they turn it over to the army. They said, if you actually do what you say you're going to do, we will burn, we will destroy Salt Lake City to the ground, we will destroy every village, we will do, nothing will be left. If you're going to take this from us, you're going to take nothing. And, it was really a fairly tense time. Scattered violence did break out all over the territory. Probably the most famous event was something called the Mountain Meadow Massacre, where a group of Mormons, and they were renegade Mormons, they claimed they had no direction from the church, and the church later disowned them and said they did not direct them to do this. But they apparently massacred a wagon train of Gentiles headed west and killed several in the southeastern part of the state or territory of Utah. And this kind of inflamed the tensions even more once it got out. And it just seemed like war was assured. There was about 2,500 U.S. soldiers headed west to meet 30,000 a lot armed Mormons. And people felt like, it was going to be war. Young and his group abandoned Salt Lake City. They left a group of Danites there. They set explosive charges throughout the city with orders to burn it and to blow up the city if the army camped inside the city. Well, luckily, compromise happened. The Mormons didn't know it, but this was kind of news throughout the Eastern papers. And at this time, the sentiments kind of switched. The public had become a little bit more forgiving, a little bit more tolerant than they had been in the past, particularly in the larger cities in the East. And as a result, there was a lot of pressure on Buchanan from his own party to basically, you know, uh, calm this situation down so it didn't develop into a full-fledged war. They were already fighting a war in Kansas. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had started what we now know as Bleeding Kansas, and it was already a tumultuous situation there. So they didn't want another basically armed war going on in the western part of the United States. So Buchanan ordered his troops to march through Salt Lake City to show them that they were there, but then to camp outside the city 40 miles away. Once the Mormons realized that things had been kind of calmed down and that compromise was in stock, they began to drift back into the city, and they returned. They began rebuilding their city again, and continued on. And you had a period here of about 2 to 3 years where the Mormons and the army kind of lived in a truce between each other. And actually, in the long run, it actually worked out for the Mormons, because this army of 30,000 soldiers camped out here. They had to have food, they had to have supplies, they had to have goods, and the only place to get it was from the Mormons. And as a result, the Mormons actually economically prospered by having the army out here. They were the ones that supplied them, and they actually ended up prospering quite a bit from the Mormons, from the army being there. So what happened next? Well, the Civil War broke out. 1861. Lincoln was very much a pragmatist, just like Brigham Young was. And he basically said, folks, we don't have time to worry about this. We've got bigger fish to fry. We have 7 states that have withdrawn from the Union, and it looks like war is going to happen. I'm going to need soldiers. So he pulled the army out of Utah and basically said, we'll leave you alone. This is what you wanted. As long as you don't bother us, we won't bother you. And so the Mormons, once again, were left in peace. And this time it lasted. There were outbreaks of violence against the Mormons throughout the rest of the history of the United States. But for the most part, at this point in time, the Mormons were left alone, and they no longer had to fear the violence and intimidation from their neighbors like they had in the past. So I always recommend a book. There's no really good movies about the Mormon experience and the Mormon Western Trek, but there is a really interesting book that involves the Mormons called the Oatman Massacre. If you look at the cover there, this is a picture of Olive Oatman. Olive Oatman was a young girl who was on a Mormon train, a wagon train west, which was attacked by Indians. And they took several of the young children prisoner, which they often did, and including Olive. And she lived with the Indians for several years, and she was made a member of the tribe. She was tattooed, as was the custom of this tribe. You can see on her chin here that she has tattooed. And eventually she was saved. She was taken back by some of the white. She was taken back and rescued by white settlers against her will, actually. She did not want to leave the Indian tribe, but they took her back. She reassimilated into the Mormon culture, but she was always kind of an outcast because of her disfigurement of the tattoos on her face. It's a very interesting story about the Mormons. It's not so much about their trek western or anything, but it's a really interesting story of captivity and survival. And again, this goes along with the grit of the Mormons. Now, what's the legacy of the Mormons to the West? Well, folks, it's simply this. The Mormons made something out of nothing. When they went to Utah, this was, as I've said, some of the most inhospitable land in the western part of the United States. And they flourished. They irrigated the soil. It bloomed. People begin to realize that, hey, maybe this great American desert, which is what the Great Plains were called between the Rocky Mountains and Missouri, maybe this Great Plains was a land that could be settled and could be made useful. And so the Great Plains, which had basically escaped settlement up to this point, began to see immigrants move into the Great Plains. And of course, we all know the story. The Great Plains eventually became the breadbasket of the United States. It's the area where we grow most of our grain crops. And, we are probably some of the best agricultural farmers in the world out in the western part of the Great Plains. But up to this point in time, it took the Mormons to kind of show us that this could be done, because up to this point in time, it was thought that this land was useless. It was called the Great American Desert, and they thought it could not be managed as such. So that's the story of the Mormons. And again, I'm a little early today, which I'm sure you won't feel sad. Next week, we're going to learn about the 49ers, those that went west seeking riches. There was a gold strike that occurred in Northern California around the area of Sacramento, and people went absolutely crazy. And as a result, you saw a vast immigration westward into California, and then ultimately into Nevada and Arizona and Colorado and other areas where gold strikes and silver strikes begin to take place. They begin to realize that there were a lot of mineral resources in the West that could be exploited. Eventually, this led us into the Dakotas, which was the catalyst for this great Sioux Wars, which took place in the 1870s and 80s. So next week, we're going to see the story of the 49ers. And then the week after that, we're going to talk about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, which was the final nail in the coffin, so to say, of the West in terms of white Western settlement. Because once we built the railroad, they just flooded into this land. And it kind of brought on the period of time we know as the Wild West, with the cattle drives and the cow towns, and the origin of the old Western towns. And we're going to see about a 25-year period there when it's an exciting period of time in American history, to say the least. So I think at this point I am done. So Kayla, I don't know if you're there.
Yes, I am here. Good job. So I got a text asking a question specifically about you. They're enjoying your program so much, and they were wondering what your background is.
Well, I'm no history teacher, obviously. I taught history for 38 years in the public schools and also on the community college level. And I'm an Ozarker. I'm a sixth generation hillbilly, as I call myself. I've got 3 college degrees, and history's just been my passion my whole life, and I enjoy all parts of it, but this is one that's always been kind of dear to my heart, is Western history. So
very cool. Oh, very good. It was actually a question from the Vitalia Solon in Ohio.
Okay.
So they were just wondering. I know lots of people are enjoying your programs, but
well, thank you. I appreciate that. Like I said, it's my passion. I love history. I knew I was going to be a history teacher from the time I was about an 8th grader, and here I am in my mid-70s still teaching history. My wife says I'm going to die teaching history.
Well, you do a great job, and everyone enjoys it. So thank you. All right, guys. Well, that ends our programs for today. So, I think Art and Donna put something in the chat for you.
Okay, Art and Donna said they, okay. I'll see what I can do, okay?
All right, that sounds
I'll see if
good.
I can get a list of books. I don't know, how would I get that to you?
Tony, I believe I have your email. I can connect you guys via email
Okay, okay,
if that
will
works.
do.
Yeah. Yeah, I have Donna's email address, so I'll get it over to you, okay?
Okay,
All right. Thanks, Tony. Bye, guys.
we'll see you.